My name is Leah Soweid. I'm a victim advocate at Monsoon, Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, Monsoon for short. And before I start, I was wondering if anyone could raise their hand if they've even heard of Monsoon. Awesome, all right, that's good. So Monsoon is one of the 7 culturally specific programs in Iowa. I'm just going to be talking about what it is, how it came to be, and what we offer in terms of services. And then I thought at the very end I would take questions just to make sure that there was enough time to get through everything. To start at the very beginning, Monsoon was founded in 2003 as a volunteer group, and it was out of Des Moines. And our executive director, Mita, started this volunteer group because she noticed that in a lot of mainstream organizations in the state, they were not equipped to meet the linguistic and cultural needs of the Asian and Pacific Islander community in the state of Iowa. So this volunteer group started, and after a few years, we got enough funding and grants where we could become a registered nonprofit in the state of Iowa. And around 2009, we opened our Iowa City branch. So we have the Iowa City office, which is more of a satellite office. It's smaller and there's less people in it. Currently, it's only myself and my supervisor that work in the Iowa City office. The Des Moines office is very much the headquarters, and it's much bigger in space and in terms of the number of people who work there. And our people we work with are the API, Asian Pacific Islander communities statewide, so we cover all 99 counties. And we work with victim survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. So what do people think makes a program culturally specific? Just give it a go.
Staff from that community that can speak the languages of the people you're serving.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So in Monsoon's case, everyone who works at Monsoon is from an API community, and we speak a language from those communities. You don't have to be fluent, but you need to know enough to get by. Because a lot of the time, the barriers we face are language barriers when it comes to our clients. So we need to be able to speak languages from those communities to best serve them. When I say Asia, by the way, when I'm saying Asian and Pacific Islanders, I'm talking about that whole continent of Asia, and the reason I say that is because that encompasses the Middle East. So we also work with people who are from the Middle East. Case in point, I'm from Lebanon. I moved here around 2 years ago, and I speak Arabic. My supervisor is from India, and she speaks Hindi. My coworker is from Vietnam, she speaks Vietnamese, so on and so forth. So that's part of how we keep the program itself culturally specific. I'm going to be but I'm going to have these for reference just because I felt like that was the best way to not ramble and be time efficient. So currently, in the history of Monsoon, there's been about 24 languages spoken. At the moment, I think it's between 10 to 12. Oftentimes, what will determine who takes the client is 2 things. The first is just location. So a lot of the time, if someone calls and they're in a county that's closer to the Iowa City office, we'll take the case. Or if they're closer to the Des Moines office, they'll take the case. But a lot of the time it does boil down to language. So for example, if there is a victim survivor here that only speaks Mandarin, and we have our only Mandarin speaking advocate in Des Moines, she or he will take the case. So that's usually what determines who will best serve the client. And we do co-advocacy with other culturally specific programs, and I will list them all at the end because I always try to make an effort to make sure that people know what resources are out there in the community. We are not university affiliated. I try to make that clear because the university has to follow different rules than we do as something that isn't university affiliated. So just to clarify, we do a lot of work with universities, a lot of our volunteers, and sometimes our campus advocates are from the university, but we are not affiliated with any university in any way, shape, or form. Similarly, we're not affiliated with law enforcement, and I try to really stress that when law enforcement or anyone is trying to refer clients to us, because there is so much distrust and fear of law enforcement and police in the API community, and historically there's just been also a lot of police brutality when it's come to that. It's just very important to clarify that we have nothing to do with law enforcement. We're not going to be talking to law enforcement about your case or what's going on, or your status or anything. So that's just to keep in mind in case anyone in the future wants to refer people to Monsoon or any other culturally specific program. It's important to keep that clear. We are also not mandatory reporters. Some culturally specific programs are, we are not. So that means that if we do get clients under 18 that decide to come to us, we are not mandated to go to police with their case. So that's also something to keep in mind, because that has come in handy during times that there have been underage victim survivors who want to come forward but don't necessarily want anyone else involved. So Monsoon does 4 things. The first is direct services, which is what victim services are all about. That's when you work one-on-one with a victim survivor or with a family. And for that, we offer a lot of different services. We do things like, we always do safety planning, which is different in a case-by-case basis. We help them find lawyers, most commonly pro bono lawyers. It gets a bit trickier when we're talking immigration services because there are much fewer pro bono immigration lawyers, and the ones that are there are usually so swamped with work that it's difficult to get them. But we try our best to get pro bono lawyers. We help with housing assistance. We help with job applications and finding jobs. We help with transportation. We do personal advocacy and personal counseling. We're not therapists ourselves, so if they do need therapy, we try our best to get them into, try to get them matched up with a therapist or a psychiatrist or anything that they're interested in. If someone accesses Monsoon services as a victim survivor, the services are lifelong, so it means that even when the case is closed or there isn't any victimization going on anymore, they can still call back with something different and we will still help them with that. So for example, if there's a case where someone wants in divorce from her abusive husband and we help her get that divorce and she disappears for 2 years and then calls us back and says, hey, you know, I'm still divorced, everything is great, but I just lost my job and I need help finding a new job, we'll help with that. So as long as you access the services as a victim survivor, they're lifelong. You're also under no obligation to stick with the services, so we always tell them, like, you can literally call once, hear about our services, and just never call back. Like, we don't do follow-up where we call and go like, so are you going to use our services or not? So it's very much up to them when they want, how they want to continue and when they want to stop the services. As most mainstream and culturally specific programs who work with victims do, we do not ever tell them what to do. It's very client-centered, so we ask what empowerment and justice looks like for them, and then we just help them based on that. A lot of the time, people can't leave their abusers, so it's not really a matter of trying to get them out of an abusive situation. It's asking them what they need to feel safest, and then working with them on that. The last thing I want to say about the direct services portion, just because I forgot to say it when I was talking about languages, is that we are not interpreters, and it can be very frustrating when people call and just expect us to come in and interpret and leave, because that's not what any culturally specific programs are for. The whole reason CSPs exist is because they can provide culturally specific services, and mainstream organizations cannot. So it can be very annoying when they call and say, we have a Mandarin speaker, come in, tell us what she's saying, and get out. We don't do that. What we do is when they do call us with that, we explain what we do. We offer to take that client and provide services of our own to that client. And a lot of the time, they're very open to that, and they'll just be like, sure, you can take the client. But in the cases they don't, we can direct them to a language line where there are paid interpreters, and their job is to just interpret. But that's just to clarify that when you call any culturally specific program, it shouldn't be just for interpretation purposes. And all our services are safe, and they're confidential, and they're free. So they're completely free. So moving on to the second thing we do a lot of outreach we do a lot of community outreach. That's a big portion of what I do as a victim advocate. And that could be anything from presenting about Monsoon, like I'm doing today, to tabling, to giving workshops and lectures and presentations. They don't necessarily need to be about victimization in the API community, but they need to be related to social justice, and they need to be related to domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking. But it can cover a very wide array of of different topics. Some examples of one of the things we've done that have been more long-term is that for the last academic year, I did something called Yoni Chats, which has been historically at Monsoon, but was just passed down to me when I started about 14 months ago. And what it is that it's a sexual health discussion group where young women get together, and in a very safe environment, we just talk about sex and sexuality, because that's very stigmatized in our communities. And I did that twice a month from October till March. And then another thing we did for Sexual Assault Awareness Month is we did something called Letter to My Body, which was where we gathered almost 200 letters from the Iowa City, Groville, and Des Moines community addressed to their bodies about times they felt in and out of control. So it covered things like sexual violence, gender norms, gender expectations. It ended up being very well publicized, which I wish I knew ahead of time, because a lot of the time I was faced with press I didn't realize were coming, and so I sound very uneloquent in all my interviews. That was not fun to read back, but yes, but it went really well. So we do things that are sometimes just a day long, an hour long, and then other things we do are programs that actually take like a really long time to do. We do community outreach with other CSPs. We can do community outreach with mainstream organizations, and we have done that in the past as well. We try to do as many community outreach events as we can, and we try to do at least one a month. So either in our Iowa City office or in our Des Moines branch. The third thing we do is we do something called a violence prevention program. That one is more based out of Des Moines because our violence prevention coordinator is in Des Moines. And that is youth focused, so every year the coordinator will work with the youth. This year we got the funding to hire around 6 part-time high school male athletes. Most of them were from the API community. One was Somali and one was from the Latinx community. And we hired them part-time to go into their communities and their high schools and do work about violence prevention, toxic masculinity, dating violence. And because it's only the first year I really worked here, I can't speak for the years before, but we just got so incredibly lucky with this group of boys, because they were really committed and very, very passionate, and they did great work. They all, actually today is their last day, and most of them are going to college, so some of them will be back next year because they haven't graduated yet, but most of them are leaving, so we'll hire new advocates. But that's been a really great part of our violence prevention program. And then the other thing that the violence prevention program does, which finished last week, is a intensive 5-day, almost summer camp type thing, and it's called Summer of Youth Activism. And it's a very intensive 5-day course where about 15 to 20, 12 to 15-year-olds come together from the API community, and we teach them about histories of oppression and about violence prevention and how to be leaders in their own communities. That's been going on for about 5 years now. And it's always received very positively, which is why we can keep it going. And then the last thing we do is technical assistance, and that's something that only the executive director does. And what that is that she travels throughout the US, and she trains other programs on how to be culturally specific with the API population. So that's the fourth thing we do, but that's something that only she is qualified to do. So I know I'm talking fast because I know that we started later than I thought, so I just want to make sure we have enough time at the end. But before I get into questions, I did want to do a bit of a Q&A with you all, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you scenarios, and I'm going to ask how you think someone from the API community would respond in those scenarios, and that's one way of highlighting why culturally specific programs are important. And then I will talk about the other 7 culturally specific programs, not in depth, but just to tell you who they are and what populations they serve, and then we can open it up to questions and have some time at the end for you to introduce what you're doing. But okay, so in this first scenario, I want you guys all to pretend that you're an international student, let's say from China. You're studying at the University of Iowa, And one night your boyfriend, girlfriend hits you, and you call the police, and the police show up. What are you expecting the police to do as an international student from China? Anyone give it a go?
How does they arrest them and put them in jail?
Yeah, I mean that's a good response. Thank you for trying. Yeah. So a lot of students, including international students, mostly international students, do not know that there is a mandatory arrest policy here. Back in our communities, and this includes Lebanon where I'm from, when you call the police for a domestic violence issue, what you are expecting, because this is what happens back home, is that they come in and they'll give a stern talking to the abuser and they'll leave. That's what happens, and that's what you're expecting to happen. And suddenly, we're getting calls because they're calling and going like, hey, I called the police, and suddenly someone's getting arrested, and they don't know what's going on, and they didn't want them to get arrested, especially because if that other person is also an international student, that really affects their visa, and suddenly the whole thing is just blown very out of proportion and not at all like they imagined. And a lot of the time, mainstream organizations and police do not know this, so it becomes very, very complicated on how to figure out how to solve that. So a lot of the time with our community outreach, part of it is educating people from the API community about what to expect when they call law enforcement. We never say don't call law enforcement. If it's an emergency, we always say call 911, but a lot of the time, people don't want to call law enforcement if there's going to be an arrest made, and there is a mandatory arrest policy which they don't know about. So that's one example. Another example, let's say you're meeting someone and he or she doesn't speak English fluently, he's from India, you guys are lawyers, and you sit down with them, you've taken their case, and you ask them if they want an advocate. What does the word advocate mean in a lot of the API communities that we're from? Give any guess? Yep. Yeah, it means lawyer in a lot of places that we're from, so it's funny because a lot of the lawyers sitting down and asking, do you want an advocate? They're like, but you're my advocate. And he's like, no, I'm not. You know, that's a totally different thing. So a lot of the time what we encourage people to say, regardless of if they speak English fluently or not, because a lot of the time it's just when we're raised in different places, advocate just means lawyer. I would encourage just using the term social worker, because that technically encompasses everything an advocate does, and that kind of just has the same meaning no matter where you're from, so people will immediately get what that is. So that's something I would encourage people to do. And the third is, right now you are a woman, you are from the Middle East, and I'm doing intake with you. And part of intake is asking about the old relationships you've been in, if you've ever been married before. What do I need to be cautious about when I'm asking those questions if I am interviewing you and you're from a very conservative part of the Middle East and you're very conservative yourself and you're a woman? And I'm asking you about old relationships and old marriages and all that jazz. What's something to keep in mind?
Are you a man or a woman doing the interview?
Great, yep. And also, regardless of who asks, unless there's trust there, it can be very difficult because in a lot of conservative places, when you're asking about things like old relationships or previous marriages, a lot of the time what they hear, and this is a generalization, so this isn't going to be every case. Everything I've listed, by the way, is not going to be applicable to everything that you see. But a lot of the times what people hear is, how many times have you had sex? And that's really, really tricky because in a lot of API communities, sex is so stigmatized that people don't want to talk about it in general. Even, especially things like sexual assault can be very tricky to get out of victim survivors. So that's important to keep in mind because a lot of the time what I encourage people to do is ask more than once over a number of weeks, because the more trust is built, the more they're going to share. And it's important to have that information because even if you're not working with her for example, a previous husband, let's say it's a current husband being abusive, it's important to know if old relationships were abusive or if she's in contact with someone in the past who's been abusive to her. So this stuff's important to know. So, I mean, would any of you have known any of that before I gave you those examples? So culturally specific programs are important, like, and they're there for a reason, and they're there because we all know that stuff going in. So to close up, I want to list the other culturally specific programs that are in Iowa. I can't tell you all of what counties they cover, because I don't think all of them are statewide. I think some of them only cover specific counties, but that's stuff you can all find on their website. So I'll just tell you their names and what communities they serve. So Monsoon for Asians and Pacific Islanders. Then you have NISA, and that's for African Family Services. NISA actually came out of Monsoon because the first people through our doors were actually people from the African community who didn't have anyone to represent them. And what ended up happening is that Mira, who is our executive director, found people who were interested in starting their own organization from the African community, and essentially trained them until they got their own funding and could become their own organization. So right now they are their own organization. They are not part of Monsoon, but Monsoon were the people who helped them get on their feet, so to speak. Meskwaki, who are for Native Americans, indigenous populations. They just changed their name to RISE. I don't know what that stands for, but the name was just switched about a month ago. Important to know. Luna, for the Latinx population. They were the first culturally specific program in Iowa, actually, a few years before Monsoon. Deaf Iowans Against Abuse, for deaf and hard of hearing. Transformative Healing, for the LGBTQIA population. That's actually in Iowa City. It's only a volunteer group at the moment, and the person who is in charge of it works at RVAP, the Rape Victim Advocacy Program.
Say again what that was, transformative?
Transformative Healing. Healing. How many am I at, if anyone's keeping count?
Five.
Six. Five. So someone said 5, someone said 6. Okay,
I'm
6.
guessing the Burmese.
I have 6.
No. That one, I think.
Embark? No.
Embark, we have a bit of issues with how Embark runs things, just because it isn't as culturally specific as that, but I don't know enough about them to really give a recommendation. But the last one is Amani, and that's for the African American population. So those are the 7 culturally specific programs in Iowa. And I'm sorry that was a lot of word vomit over a very short period of time, but just to make sure we have enough time for questions and for other people to talk. Does anyone have any questions for me? And I will be just passing these down, if that's okay, to just pass it. All right.
You're located in the East Del Plaza, correct?
Yeah, we're located in East Del Plaza on the 2nd floor. I always like saying East Del Plaza is where the driver's license station is, because that's mostly what people know it by. But on that 2nd floor, there's a ton of nonprofits, so we're one of them, yes. So can I answer any questions?
So are all of these other organizations based in Iowa City? Do they have offices in Iowa City too?
NISA has an office in Iowa City, actually also in East Del Plaza, yeah.
One ways from NISA.
And both NISA and Monsoon also have Des Moines offices. Everyone else, I can't, like, I know that Luna is not based in Iowa City. Deaf Iowans is City. Sorry? Mason City. I think Deaf Iowans Against Abuse is in Cedar Rapids. I don't know where Amani is in terms of what counties they cover. Transformative Healing is based in Iowa City because she works in Iowa City. She lives in Cedar Rapids, so. And Meskwaki is not in Iowa City now. So you can find out all the information about their locations and what counties they serve on their website, but I just don't know any of them specifically personally, just because I haven't worked here long enough. So I would recommend reaching out to them. I just like mentioning them because I think it's just important to know what's out there in terms of resources for survivors. So yeah. All right. Can I answer any other questions?
Do you know if any organizations are building up to expanding the seven and maybe to represent more communities?
I know that we are working right now with the Middle Eastern community to try to, we have someone who's employed at Monsoon right now but she's very much still in training, and it's going to take years. But she is working on a program now called Safi, which is for Arab families, like Middle Eastern families. But that's not going to be its own organization for a long time. And other than that, I don't know of any other organizations that are coming into play. Thank you. All right.
What kind of numbers are you talking about that are in this area from that community?
From that. So we have a very big, so in general, it's actually really interesting, Iowa in general, when you look at the number of API populations. So in Dubuque, for example, there's a huge number of Marshall Islanders, which a lot of people wouldn't, like, it's just such a, when people think about it, such a random place for people from that community. And then we have a very big population of people from Nepal and Burma in the Des Moines area. Here, there's a lot of people from China, a lot of people from Vietnam. In Iowa as a whole, there's a lot of people from India. There's a lot of people from the Middle East. Really, it's like it's a whole bunch of people from all those different communities. And because there was such a need, like culturally specific programs don't come into being unless there is a population big enough that they need to be served. So that's, I mean, I can't give you numbers in terms of like the exact number of the API population is X, but there is a big enough population where services are needed specifically for that community. So that's what I can tell you about that. I don't have the actual figure.
Do you have the number of clients you're serving for your organization statewide?
We do it by year. This year, because we started 2019, I don't have the number for that yet, because that's going to come out in December. The last year, it was about 500, I think, last year, but that's excluded, like, because, you know, sometimes we also don't keep the numbers as well as we're supposed to, so that's only what we wrote down. So yeah.
Have you come to speak at have you been down to the Iowa Works office downstairs?
I talked to someone from the Iowa Works who wanted us to come in, but never followed up with like a date or a time. So
we will do
that. Was
that.
in the plan. Yes, yeah, that would be great. But
Since we're
Neighbors.
very close to
downstairs.
I'm just curious how much.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how many of your, like, if you were to say a percentage of the people that you're working with where employment becomes something you're helping them with, because I think that's something we can be of a lot of assistance with you.
Yeah.
And maybe
that would be
you
great
could.
to learn more about. So that would be awesome.
So I will follow up with you and we'll get you a date to come in and do that.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
I think that because I just recently found out about the Marshallese from a family navigator at the hospital, and nobody knows that this large population is in Dubuque.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've heard somebody, of course you work with them, but I've asked a lot of people. So yeah.
I think in Dubuque also, I haven't worked with them, but my supervisor has. There is a Pacific Islander health initiative, and I believe it's out of Dubuque. So I think they also do a lot of work with the Marshallese population. So just a fun fact. But yeah.
Did that somewhat originate with either the University of Dubuque or Clark College?
Sorry?
The number of Marshall Islanders in Dubuque, is it anything to do with like the University of Dubuque or?
I don't think so. I think it's just, you know, like when you look at the history of the Marshall Islands and what the U.S. did to them, a lot of the time it's just because they're placed there because that's where they were placed by the U.S. government. So I'm not sure if it was because of university.
Yeah, I used to work in Dubuque and almost 10 years, more than 10 years lived there, and if you would have said, you know, Dubuque has a large Marshall Island population, I was like,
what, really? Yeah, no, but it does.
Where'd they come from?
Yeah.
But it is rather interesting. I mean, I remember we had, I can't remember which church it was, but it was a Somali family, and for some reason, this church took them from Georgia to Minnesota and then down to Iowa City in the middle of winter. And I remember them coming in trying to, you know, get housing, and of course we don't have any emergency housing programs. And the people had, I mean, you mentioned that before, I mean, they didn't even know what snow was, let alone landing here, you know, when it was, you know, 10 below zero and, you know, 3 feet of snow. And that was the other issue. They didn't have proper clothing. But yeah, you're right, that church just had sponsored people, and that's just how it shook out,
yeah.
that there were families here that would help out, and
Yeah.
Is there a last question before we go move on? Okay, I thought that was a very beautiful
Yeah,
presentation.
thank
Thank you so much.